Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, and if there's a good evening out there, welcome very much to the ServCollab JSM webinar on the sustainability, the UN Sustainability Development goals. And we're very, very pleased to welcome everyone to come along to this session. We're going to be hearing from one author of each of the commentaries that we've recently published in JSM. So it's in issue 2 for the 2024 volume of Journal of Services Marketing. We do encourage you to go and have a read of the editorial and all the commentaries. And we've been informed by Emerald Publishing that these articles will be free to download and access for the month of May 2024. So please do make sure that you jump on and download those articles while they are free to access. And please feel free to share links to the editorial and the commentaries with any of your colleagues or partners that you think may be interested to know more about how can service research help us improve life on planet Earth. So the overview of the session is we're going to commence with Ray Fisk from ServCollab. Then we're going to hear from Maria Rossetti, who's going to tell us a bit of background about the SDGs. I'll outline the editorial, and then we're going to hear from one author from each of our commentaries. So we've got Joy Parkinson, Maria Rossetti, Michael Polonsky. We have Mahesh Subramani, who is stepping in for Mark Rosenbaum. We have Ross Gordon, Andrew Gallant, and Sultan Kabadai. And then at the end, we will deal with questions and answers. Now, given the timing, we won't take questions throughout. So if you can please pop your questions in the chat, we will deal with all of those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Ray to kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I'll let you navigate with the slides since you've got the button on your side. So this is the overview slide of what I'm
just
going
say
to
next.
Basically, so basically this topic is developing service research on the SDGs and why ServCollab started collaborating with the Journal of Services Marketing on that. And Rebecca Russell-Bennett, of course, is one of the co-editors of the journal. Mark Rosenbaum is the other. So we got into a discussion about what could service researchers do on the SDGs, and we found ourselves wanting to compress them. And you're going to be hearing a lot more about how we found a way to shrink the 17 into 7 service research themes. But I need to tell you, Rebecca, next time more about, with the next slide then, I need to tell you more about, Rebecca, you hearing me? Rebecca.
It is the next slide.
The next slide showing.
I'm not sure what happened. Yeah, please.
Just a time lag.
It's not a problem. We'll get a lot of practice today. So, ServCollab's purpose and process is this slide. Our name is a contraction of serving humanity through collaboration. So serving humanity is our purpose, the purpose of the organization, and through collaboration is the process we pursue to achieve that purpose. And these commentaries that we're sharing today are a great example of that. Now, everything we've done in ServCollab has been based on transformative service research, and you can see our website address there on the bottom slide. And Rebecca, if you'll take me to the next slide, I'll tell you everyone more about the founding article and a key quote from it. On the left side of the screen, you can see the title of the article, Elevating the Human Experience Through Service Research Collaborations, and the members of the co-authorship. The other members are the advisory board for ServCollab. And since I mentioned we're based on transformative service research, Laurie Anderson and Amy Ostrom are part of the advisory board, and they certainly helped launch transformative service research. I think they were considered the primary instigators. So here's the quote from our article. In the article, we said, human life depends on planet Earth. So the service research field needs to respond by encouraging projects that balance serving human needs now with serving the needs of future generations by protecting the fragile service ecosystem of planet Earth. Now, we wanted that statement in the article because we say we're focused on serving humanity, But of course, humanity depends on planet Earth. So we have to be concerned about planet Earth too. Next slide, Rebecca. So here's a summary of ServCollab's perspective in terms of how we are looking at things. We know from all the prior service research, especially service dominant logic and service science from this century, that humanity has always lived in service systems. They might be monetary service systems, they might be social service systems, but they're all service systems. And many service systems are simply not serving humanity well. That's where the transformative service research issue comes up. And the third point to make, and this is part of, again, of our commentaries today, we should design service systems that wisely serve humanity. So this is part of why we even got into this collaborative conversation about these commentaries. And the next slide, Rebecca. So fundamentally, ServCollab believes that service researchers are uniquely positioned to help accelerate human progress. We think that because we can see that the world is comprised of 8 billion humans all living in service systems, and not everybody sees that. We do see that. We think the fact that we know that and can see it, we can start working on helping solve these problems. And again, that's tied to what we're doing today. One last slide that Rebecca is going to share here, and then it'll be on to the next. So after today, there is a pre-conference workshop that will happen as a follow-up to these commentaries. And that pre-conference workshop is on the morning of Thursday, June 6th. It'll be only if you're attending the ServCig conference in Bordeaux, France. And we invite you to attend if you're already registered. But if you aren't already planning on going and aren't part of the program, from what I've heard, it would be very hard to get yourself added. But if you do register, or if you haven't registered yet, be sure to include the free workshop as part of that. That'll be, again, the morning. That'll be before the rest of the conference starts. The rest of the conference starts that evening, or that afternoon, I mean. The workshop attendees that do join us there will be discussing these service themes, these 7 themes, and we'll be brainstorming possible service research projects on them. So it'll be an exciting opportunity to do that in the same room as opposed to in a Zoom room like today. And we'll also be discussing how such projects can become ServCollab research projects and become part of a larger research agenda. So with that, that wraps up what I needed to say. And after I finish here, I'll put a link in the chat to those free articles in the chat. Well, free now from Emerald for a month, the 7 commentaries and the editorial.
Thanks, Ray. My name is Maria Rosidi, and I'm going to provide everyone with a quick overview of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, the UN is an international organisation, and it was created to maintain peace and promote human rights. It was founded in 1945 following the Second World War, and it began with 51 countries, but it's now expanded to 193 member states. It's known for peacekeeping, peace building, conflict prevention, and humanitarian assistance. The UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has a long history. It was founded in the 1992 Earth Summit Agenda, which then subsequently became the 2020 to 2015 Millennium Development Goals. Those then evolved into the current SDGs. So we have 17 SDGs. They're all interlinked, and they've all been adopted by 193 member states. The SDGs focus on 5 pillars: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Next slide. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are a blueprint for action. So there's a very strong implementation focus. And the focus is on both global and local action, as well as practical and positive action. It's also about the actions of governments, for-profits, non-profits, as well as groups, communities, and individuals. Unlike the Millennial Development Goals, the SDGs are applied to all countries, and all countries demonstrate their accountability through various forms, such as publications or events. Next slide. The SDGs are not someone else's problem. So the scope of SDGs covers all countries, all services, all of humanity, and all of the planet. So as service researchers, we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to situate our research within the SDGs and to step up to the challenge of using our knowledge, skills, and abilities for the greater good. So together as a service research community, we can make a difference. So on that note, I'll hand over to Rebecca, who'll provide an overview of the editorial.
Great, thank you, Maria. Okay, so the editorial. So I'm really grateful to the work of my colleagues, Mark, Ray, and Maria. This was a fantastic series to work on, and I feel really privileged that we've been able to do this with JSM. I believe it's the first business journal that has addressed all 17 SDGs in the one issue. Okay, so a historical overview of service research. So it started in the 1980s, and I have to say I wasn't an academic at this point. This is what we know from speaking to our esteemed colleagues who more or less founded the field. And we know that scholars from around the world began studying and trying to solve the service problems of customers and employees. And the stories that I've heard from people like Ray, Christopher Lovelock, about the difficulty in actually having respect and credibility for the field in the 80s. The services wasn't something to just dismiss. It was actually a real phenomena. Was quite a struggle. And I think it's something that we take for granted now as service scholars, that this was not an easy task to establish this field. Journal Services Marketing is the pioneering journal in services marketing, and it was launched in 1986. So we've been around a significant amount of time, launched many careers, and in fact, we did a retrospective in 2016 that went back to the first decade and published many articles from that era by the original authors. So please have a look at that. So in 2013, I guess let's fast forward, and transformative service research introduced a higher purpose for service research that went beyond profit. So when I started doing service research, it was about loyalty, satisfaction, and service quality, and haven't we come a long way since then? And then in 2018, as Ray mentioned, ServCollab launched and recognised the importance of the human experience. And we've seen literally an explosion of research in the TSR area, which is now culminated in this SDG special issue with JSM. However, we know that the only way for service researchers to serve the complexity of human needs is to engage with the higher goals of the United Nations SDGs. And the problem is there's 17 of them. There's a lot of detail around it. And so when I was having a chat to Ray and Mark in the very beginning about, well, how might we tackle this? We decided to come up with a way of synthesizing those 17 SDGs into what we could see were 7 themes that represented the kind of work that we as service researchers can do. Once we'd worked that out, there's been some tweaking of these along the way with our authors. We then invited a number of service scholars who are well known in their field to work together to put together these commentaries. And in some instances, these teams were new. They'd never met each other before we invited them to come together. And so it's been fantastic seeing the magic occur of scholars who are share a common purpose, come together and in fact form new research teams themselves that have then continued to further collaborate. So it's been a very collaborative process. I guess the inspiration sitting under our approach, and in particular in the editorial, were these 2 frameworks. So the first is Kate Raworth's donut economics. For those of you not familiar with Kate's work, it's an exceptional approach to rethinking economics and doing it in a way that protects people and planet. And so essentially the donut is the green space. So this is where we want to play. We want to play in between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. And what happens when we don't is that we can overshoot the ecological ceiling. We see all kinds of problems with the environment, and they're listed out there on the outer circle. And when we have a shortfall from the social side, we end up with all kinds of problems in water, food, health, housing, many of the problems that we see today occurring. And so the aim is to be in this regenerative and distributive economy rather than economy that's just simply about GDP and about money. The second framework comes from an article in Journal of Service Management with Linda Alkire, myself, Joe Previty, and Ray Fisk. And it's called the Service Thinking Mindset. And this is something that evolved out of numerous services conferences, ServCig, Frontiers, and it started with 5 service thinking practices. So what does service thinking mean? Well, we define it as being, it's about service integrity, service empathy, service courage, service respect, and service inclusion. These practices shape the way that we regulate, whether it's self-regulation or whether it's external regulation through public policy or law. These affect how different entities are motivated, create opportunity, or have the ability to do service thinking, and that in turn affects practices. So it's a circular framework. These 2 frameworks were really the underpinning of the editorial, and in fact, the entire series that we have with our commentaries. So finally, our call to action. We believe that service scholars can envision a better future through the SDGs. We also know that service organisations seek practical ways to achieve a better future, and that we need to work with our practitioners in order to actually be able to sustain and regenerate human and planetary service ecosystems. Publishing in the journals is simply not enough. We actually have to make sure that we work to have our thoughts and our research actually implemented in the real world. Otherwise, we run the risk that they just sit in dusty volumes on a shelf, metaphorical that it is, and never actually get implemented. So this is actually very critical. In each of these commentaries, there is a framework presented, and importantly, there is a pathway of research agendas to take us forward. So I'm going to hand over now to Joy Parkinson, who's going to take us through the first commentary. And Joy, just tell me when to move slides for you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks for a great introduction. So the first commentary is on services that enable well-being of the human species, and that draws together the first 3 SDGs. And of course, they're all interlinked and intertwined, and we can't really achieve one without achieving all 3 of them. So end poverty in all its forms everywhere, end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture, which is really important. And you'll see that it's really linked to many of the other SDGs as well. And then the third one of good health and well-being is ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages and all stages of life. Thanks, Rebecca. So we looked to other areas of the literature to really understand what was driving each of these 3 SDGs and what was needed for the future as well. So we can see that there's still a lot of people throughout the world, even throughout COVID and post-COVID times, are living in poverty. There's still a lot of hunger and food insecurity throughout the world as well. Many facts here, so I'll just give you a very brief overview. And then moving into good health and well-being, a lot of the literature really is around health care rather than health promotion. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well, and a lot of good health and well-being. And all 3 of these are really underpinned by the social determinants of health as well. And they're the conditions in which people are born, they live, work and play, and age as well. So this really highlights the interrelationship of the 3 SDGs as poverty and poor nutrition negatively impacting health and well-being. Thanks, Rebecca. So So as I said before, there's really not a lot of literature or a lot of work that's been done in the first two SDGs. So it's very scant in no poverty. There's a little bit of work that's been done on financial well-being, but most of the work's been done on base of the pyramid. So lots of potential there for further research. Zero hunger, there's virtually no service research that's done in this area, which is quite surprising. The little bit that has been done is on food wellbeing and focusing on service design of restaurants, for example, and food experiences. So it doesn't really speak to reducing hunger, rather it focuses on increasing profits for commercial organisations. So it really indicates that there is a large gap in this area of research, particularly in services. And then in good health and wellbeing, there is a little bit more. Of course, there's a lot of work that's been done around healthcare, but that still is looking after people after they've, developed chronic diseases. So a lot of work to be done in that area as well. Thanks, Rebecca. So what we did was come up with a theory of change, drawing on the themes that we identified in the literature from other areas, to move people from the individual to the collective, to population, and then finally to collective wellbeing. So we really focused on collective wellbeing as what was underpinning solving these first three SDGs and drawing them together for the wellbeing of the human species. So the themes that really emerged were social protection, sufficient resources, and they were all sorts of resources, not just financial resources, quality nutrition, food security, social determinants of health, because they really do underpin, all of health and wellbeing, and commercial determinants of health come into that as well, and then quality healthcare services. And then moving through community to population service outcomes, so developing services to serve for collective wellbeing, enabling services for inclusive progress, and finally transformative services for sustainable consumption, which is also really important. And these will then combine or come together for collective impact to serve, enable, and transform the collective well-being of the human species. And so underpinning all of this, what we need is a foundation of working on service ecosystems, collective partnerships, and then policy and advocacy as well to develop sustainable service mobilisation through these different mechanisms. And of course, underpinning all of this, we need to have ongoing monitoring and evaluation as well. So we need new metrics and a new way for measuring the necessary conditions, the service outcomes and collective impact. Thanks, Rebecca. And then finally, drawing on those outputs, we came up with a proposed future research agenda, and we've developed a range of questions, which of course are all in our commentary that you can read further. But yeah, it's a really exciting area of research, and we really hope that a lot of people draw on this research agenda to promote the well-being of the human species. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Take two. I'm going to be presenting SDG 2, which was based on services that provide an opportunity for all humans. So this was a wonderful opportunity to work with Linda and Amanda, who I hadn't worked with before. We were able to bring together some collective wisdom and insight, and so it was a fantastic collaborative experience. Our service research theme was number 2, and it comprised 3 SDGs: gender equality, SDG 4 on quality education, and SDG 10 on reducing. Thanks, Rebecca. We had a look at the literature in the services field around these 4 SDGs. And like other themes, we found that there wasn't a lot written. But what was written, there were certain gaps within the literature. So we broke these down, as you can see here on the screen. So kicking off with SDG 4, quality education, we noticed a number of patterns. First of all, education was underrepresented in general in the services research literature. And what was presented tended to focus just on students rather than other stakeholders within the education ecology. It also tended to be higher education centric, so it didn't look at schools, for example, or colleges. It was had a predominant focus, on public education. So private education wasn't included. There were other forms as well, such as commercial providers of education either. There to be no explicit linkage to the SDGs throughout all of the research that we found. And there tended to be a focus on particular theories and methods. So it wasn't expansive, if you like. The next SDG was gender equality. And what we noticed within the literature that was published here was that it predominantly came from the global north. And while it provided perspectives of both males and females, it tended to have a cisgender view. It focused on specific stages of service encounter, so it wasn't holistic. It didn't give us an overall view of the service journey for in terms of gender. It tended to focus only on the retail service sector as well. And it was really interesting because it focused on the differences between gender rather than doing a deep dive into whichever gender they were focusing on. There's a lot of work that's been done on gender and gender inequality from other services marketing, but we noticed that that hadn't been drawn into the services marketing area. So there was this insularity in that it was just pulling from what we already knew. And that was obviously an area that we can expand on going forward. And there was a limited range of methodologies that were apparent. In fact, we found that across all three of the SDGs, is that the methodological suite, if you like, was rather narrow. With the last SDG we looked at, which was reduced inequalities, we found that there had been some very recent publications and that these had occurred in high-ranked journals, which was again a global north predominance in terms of the context, which is an area that we can start to consider what's happening in the global south. Consumer retail centric, and with a focus on transformative services research. Again, typically a focus using quantitative methods and particular countries. There wasn't a lot of differences, for example, or points of parity. There was an emphasis on inclusion and ending discrimination. So this, of the three SDGs, was perhaps the most progressive. We then took our learnings and created a service opportunities framework. And what we're trying to represent here is the interaction or interplay between all three SDGs. One thing we came to was the power of education, and that it's actually education that ties all these things together, and that education, if you like, is the mechanism to reduce inequality and to help to address gender equality as well. So, for example, as we've got there, education equalises, and what we meant by that was education, for example, enables social mobility, which can help to reduce income inequalities. And on the other side, we get the powers. So we're saying here that education has the power to empower women and girls to enable equal leadership and to move forward in terms of health and rights. Thanks, Rebecca. We drew all three SDGs together to create 5 overarching and intertwined, if you like, research questions. We also developed a research agenda for each SDG individually, which we invite you to read the paper to have a look at. So, for example, among the 5 research questions, the first one, how can service providers advance educational outcomes for women and girls to reduce inequalities across borders? So we created these 5, and we certainly invite people to engage with the research, and we would love to hear from anybody to advance any research. Thanks, Rebecca.
Great, over to Michael.
Thank you very much. We looked at services that Ray, Rebecca, and I, I've known them both, but we never worked together. Actually, I'd known Ray for, I think, over 30 years. We never worked together. Services that sustainably manage resources for all humans and regenerative service economy framework. I think the regenerative focus is actually really critical because in this, Rebecca, next one, in this theme, we combined energy, water, and production and consumption is very all-encompassing. Next slide, Rebecca. Sorry. Basically, what we did in this review is we did a systematic review, as everyone did, and we found that there was very limited work in the services domain. And I think one thing everyone else has talked about, I think there is a large volume of literature outside the services domain on water, energy, a range of production consumption issues, and just regenerative issues. We identified 202 papers. On clean water, we found 3 in the services literature, 19 on energy, which tended to focus more on solar energy and the adoption of consumption energy. And in responsible consumption production, there was a fair amount. But what there wasn't was really any literature talking about the value on the ecosystem. And I think that's one of the critical issues that we identified within the service domain is it talked about responsible consumption and production. It talked about circular economy. We talked about efficient utilization of water or toilets in retail settings, but we didn't see anything talking about how we value and provide services, or importantly, the services provided by the environment to humans through that consumption and production process. There was a very linear process that was adopted in the literature, and which focuses on, you extract, produce, use, dispose, rather than the circular perspective. There was some special services related to, again, energy and water, that are there, many journals on water and the services that water systems provide to humanity, but also how we manage those systems for humanity. Sustainability related services omit a large proportion of business to business supplies chain issues. And in terms of services, especially for the management of the environment, for consumption and production, energy and water, many of those services are about how organizations, for example, environmental auditing, environmental management systems, all these are critical to the service delivery process because we need to be able to understand and measure what we're actually trying to manage. So as I said, there was very little literature on the services. Oh, that's okay, Rebecca. That's all right. I jump around. I apologize. And what we came up with is looking at an indigenous community perspective, this idea about intergenerational custodianship, whereas the interconnection between people and planet, as Rebecca talked about in terms of donut economics, there's a quote that says, "A pile of gold won't feed you on a dying planet." So having all these resources is not possible without having a environmental system that is thriving with or without humanity. So we looked at this intergenerational custodian mindset, which came extensively from a lot of indigenous literature, talking about how people and the environment are connected, and we're all part of one and another. I think one of the things we talked about is in some earlier work I did, and I think we talked about in the paper, is in Abrahamic religions in the Bible. In Genesis verse 6 talks about man will have dominion over the earth. And man does not have dominion over the earth. Man is collaborative with the earth. So we talked about that perspective. Then we integrated this service inclusion perspective to talk about how we can bring together humanity and services and the environment. And to me, our diagram, and it was just coincidentally, to me, it looks like a life preserver on a boat. with the little rings of these interconnections, and how we can then use service inclusion. We can use the intergenerational custodian mindset, and then we can have this interconnectivity between service practices that allows us to have a regenerative service system. Next, Rebecca, please. In our future directions, we talked about a range of works. Again, it is very challenging. We didn't focus on the particular individual domains. We focused on the broader system about how we can connect all natural resources and bring in nature as a service provider. Because matter of fact, when I went and looked about service ecosystems, the first literature, that was one of my parts for this paper, the first discussion of service of ecosystems and service ecosystems has nothing to do with business. It actually talks about the value of the ecosystem to humanity, or the critical nature. So how can government integrate responsibility through SDGs, dynamics and tensions between actors and SDGs and the environment, service performance indicators on how well we're actually working to regenerate the system or maintain the system in the way that it operates. This whole idea about a regenerative service economy, there's a whole range of services that are designed to regenerate natural resources that tend not to be examined. Actor capabilities for regenerative services for both humans and the environmental system. We then looked at the intergenerational custodian mindset, which really is dependent, relies very much on a circular perspective, and how we need to begin considering that we need to maintain resources, not just for today, but for the future, and move away potentially from the extraction based perspective to a regenerative based perspective. So how do we actually begin thinking about what is the value? And part of this intergenerational custodian mindset even relates to how within service systems and business more generally is we view profit and viability in the short term. We don't look at what is the organizational's viability for the next 50 years. We look at what is our profit for the next quarter. And those sorts of issues are going to be important. Metrics is going to be a critical issue. And in SDGs, because we're trying to integrate human value and environmental value, and notice I don't think I've mentioned in my discussion profits at all, because profits are Mother Nature doesn't have profits. There aren't excess resources. I guess there are in some cases, but again, nature balances that. So how do service thinking strategies mitigate these negative environmental consequences of human activity? I guess so it's really beginning to integrate these trade-offs of externalities in service thinking, which transformative service is beginning to do, talking about the harms in systems. We still talk about that as actors, as natural, as human actors, but again, thinking about the environmental actors as well. And I think that's all.
Thanks, Michael. Mahesh.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Excellent presentation so far, and we're going to be building upon those a little bit. So as you probably know, Mark and I come from slightly different disciplinary orientations. He's a marketing guy with the TSR orientation, whereas I'm an OBHR guy who has a focus on high-performance work systems. So when we came together, we started to look at what SDG 8 and 9 have in common and how those two can be combined together to tell a coherent story. Now, SDG 8, we honed into the term decent work. And then within SDG 9, we honed into the idea of the macroeconomic contextual factors that allowed for development and infrastructure. So we said, how do you sort of bring these two pieces together? So when you think of decent work, there are really many different versions or definitions of decent work. But in general, when we talk about decent work within psychology, the focus is on employees who face marginalization and marginalization due to low social status, limited opportunities for self-expression, and how that leads them to perceive a low level of volition and agency. In other words, people who are used to being marginalized and discriminated against and stigmatized tend to also start seeing themselves as folks who don't have the opportunity to develop and who also feel that they're stagnating somewhat in their jobs and their careers. So we did a deep dive in the literature on decent work, and we found 264 different articles on that topic, did a bibliometric analysis to find out what are the key areas where the research seems to be flourishing, and what are the areas where the research is quite dormant or stagnating. And what we found was that when you look at decent work, most of the research tends to be focused on the policy level things of the nature of sustainable practices at the organizational level or governmental policies, specifically, ILO, International Labor Organization, and their definitions and their diktats and so on. So really very policy-oriented, very macro-oriented, not as much focused on the individual experiences themselves. Then we went off to look at SDG 9, and one of the interesting aspects of SDG 9 really is on the developing world, and the term that is used is least developed countries. Again, a term that we could argue does not take into account the fact that development is not just economic, but it's about many other things as well. But that's unfortunately the term the United Nations uses. So we looked at the least developed countries, and we combined that with keywords such as service work, frontline work, and so on and so forth. And we found another 160 to 163 articles. We kind of honed that down, came down to 134 papers. And what we found across those is that there is really no consistent theme. So I need to go back a little bit for a second to talk about decent work. When we looked at the literature with decent work, we found that most of the work that's published is published in vocational behavior journals. There was no, we didn't find a single service article with decent work in its keyword. This is not to say that we don't look at decent work or the lack of decent work in services. It's just that it doesn't sort of bubble to the top and become a keyword, right? But it's still an issue. And that's the same thing that we actually see with this, with SDG 9 as well. We see an overrepresentation of population studies kinds of journals as well as economic journals, but we don't see a whole lot of involvement either for management or marketing when it comes down to understanding, what are the factors that lead to economic development and infrastructure in least developed countries. So we took the two together and we sort of said, well, here's what we need. In order to encourage decent work, we need to have investments that need to be made at the individual level of analysis, organizational level of analysis, as well as the policy level. But we also have to start thinking about what is our role as service researchers and scholars when it comes down to uniting SDG 8 and 9 and actually trying to create a more sustainable and decent workforce. Rebecca, if you don't mind, would you move to the next slide? And thank you very much. So we found 4 key areas where we thought that we as service researchers ought to play. The first one has to do with participatory action research and using, PAR, participatory action research as a paradigm for doing research. Currently, when we do research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, we treat ourselves as the experts in the field. And we go in and we gather data from the field, and then we analyze the data. And then sometimes we feed that data back to the people who are sort of experiencing those specific factors, or we just publish it in papers, in journals, right? So that's typically the way we operate. So there is this dichotomy between the expert researcher and the non-expert researched right? What participatory action research does is it talks about how the individuals who participate in this research are also equal to the researchers. While the researchers might have qualitative research skills, the people who they do research on have lived experience. So in participatory action research, what you do is that the researcher and the subjects or participants work together to design research studies that are relevant to them. They go out, collect data, they analyze the data together, and then they interpret the data together. And that way they can design interventions that are directly relevant to their lives. So in other words, what we're arguing is that we ought to, not abide by the dichotomy or split between the objective outsider who comes in and does research and the subjective insider who participates in the research as a participant or subject. The second piece that we focused on was promoting grassroots advocacy, and the idea is that there is a lot of work that's out there regarding change, but that's pretty top-down change. Organizational leaders sort of drive change down the hierarchy. But there is a robust body of literature now about grassroots advocacy. So we talked about how grassroots advocacy might be one way to create more decent work and decent employment, and how that can be both understood and researched by us, as well as we could play a more proactive role in creating that kind of grassroots advocacy. Third, we talked about implementing digitized services. Mark and I came in from completely two different angles. For Mark, digitization was a solution to the lack of decent work. And the idea is that work that is, stigmatized, work that is low status, can be simply replaced by computers and technology, and then we're done with that, right? So that's not a problem anymore. And I gave an example in the previous session, and that was really about robots that clean toilets, for instance. You don't need an individual to go out and do that anymore. But I had a slightly different perspective, which was that digitization can also lead to dehumanization of both the employee and the customer. So what is the best balance between those two? And we kind of talk about that in the article. And then finally, addressing soft skills and deficiencies. So the idea that technology is supplanting a lot of the human action, that human activities when it comes down to service delivery. And what are some ways for us to, differentiate the services using individual soft skills, and how important it is for governments and organizations to band together to create these soft skills among their workforce. In the last slide, we just have some future research directions. I'm not going to get into these in any great detail, but we do ask a couple of questions. For instance, how does automation impact service employment in LDCs? So in other words, in a lot of these least development countries, what's happened is that they've sort of skipped the entire service stage. They move from manufacturing to digitization directly. In that kind of a context, what role does decent work play? How do you address wage disparities in the workplace, discrimination in LDCs, right? So a lot of times what happens is that these employing people seems to be an end in itself, as opposed to providing them with high quality and highly meaningful kind of work. How do you sort of make sure that the work that they do is not sort of non-decent, so to speak? So that's all I've got. And I hope that you will be able to read our paper and get some ideas. And then please do write to us if you have any questions. Thank you.
Right, over to you, Ross.
Thank you, everyone. I worked with Justina Vink on looking at services from institutions that offer fair and sustainable living for humans. Next slide, please. So when we started to look at this, we ended up kind of taking a slightly different approach to writing this commentary, because when we started looking around the service literature regarding offering fair and sustainable living for all humans, we recognised that there wasn't really seeming to be much there at all, and similar to some of the other commentaries, not much linking specifically service research to the SDGs. And this actually encouraged us to take a little bit of a step back and try and interrogate why this might be going on. And what we actually did is went back to the UN, publications and reports regarding the SDGs, how the SDG indicators are playing out as we approach 2030. And recognise that if you go outside the service literature and across the social science and I guess kind of political commentary literature, there's actually a growing criticism of the SDGs. Indeed, if you look at the United Nations recent SDG status report published in 2022, it highlighted that there have been many failures in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. There has been a recognition that there's been some discursive impact. So we're all talking about SDGs in service research, and people are aware of what the SDGs are and that they're important. But when we actually look on the ground for evidence and evaluation of impact, there's really quite limited transformative impact in terms of things like legislative changes or even resource allocation. So critics have actually identified that in some ways the SDGs are perception management tools, and they kind of promote a delusion of our current economic and political systems as being part of the solution rather than potentially being part of the problem. And we've also heard from other presenters today that, the kind of framing of the SDGs and the evaluation of them and the impact they're having tend to come from a quite, neo-colonialist, Western dominant perspective, relatively paternalistic, and fail to address kind of the power imbalances that are inherent in that discourse. Next slide, please. So as again, we kind of took a step back, from just, evaluating the existing evidence here and wondered, okay, what's going on here? Why are the SDGs seemingly failing? And as service researchers, recognising that we actually need to understand that a bit more, to inform what we're doing. And as critical scholars, this naturally led us into, kind of considering the need for a critical look at the role of service research in addressing the SDGs, and particularly SDG 11 and 16. So this led us to kind of critically examine the ways in which service research might be complicit in, touting an alignment with the SDGs, while actually reproducing the political economy of neoliberal agendas that have been criticised from external sources as part of the reason why this is failing. And in effect, really creating harmful unintended consequences and getting in the way of sustainable development that we want to achieve. If we don't look at the system and critique and think about how we change the system, it's going to hold us back from actually successfully delivering on this agenda. So we started to think about the importance of drawing from critical social theories to help challenge some of the biases, assumptions, and power structures that are inherent in this kind of framing, and that could therefore aid interventions in trying to tackle some of the deep structural issues that we've already heard some other commentators talk about, and open up alternative approaches to service design and delivery that's aligned with transformative aims. And interestingly, the adoption of a more critical but critically constructive and productive perspective is something that's happened in other subdisciplines of marketing and consumer research. One example, that Tadeuszki et al. Paper, which proposes and introduces a critical agenda in transformative consumer research. So this kind of led us to start informing our focus on the examination of how service research has addressed SDG 11 and 16. Next slide, please. So when we actually then took that into, evaluating what research is out there on addressing SDG 11 and 16, we found that TSR, Transformative Service Research, has certainly outlined ambitious goals to create uplifting changes and improvements in well-being, especially, including, fair and sustainable living for all humans. But there's actually, akin to a lot of the other areas that we've heard about today, a limited body of service research addressing the specific issues that fall under SDG 11 and 16, which includes, addressing refugee crisis, human trafficking, disaster preparedness, food waste, and having fair and just and effective police and judicial services. Now, what much of the existing work and service research that does look at these areas is commended for offering practical suggestions on how we might realise ambitions related to these SDGs. But there is certainly a need for much more evidence on the ground that service research is having the transformative impact that we say we want it to have. And what we found in the limited work, particularly on fair and just institutions, was that there's really a need of work in service research to move beyond or challenge some of the neoliberal assumptions, things like the privatization and commodification of public services, for example. So the limited research that we found on legal and police and judicial services was actually about the potential benefits of privatization, rather than actually how can these be fairer and more just institutions that support and uplift SDGs. And much of the very limited existing work in these two areas of the SDG 11 and 16 really kind of lacked that kind of critique of the underlying social economic systems and political systems, that kind of capitalistic neo-colonialist kind of framing that underpin many of the wicked problems associated with addressing these goals, whether it's climate change or whether it's kind of justice and fairness for all. So through this kind of, I guess, more critical analysis, but a critically constructive perspective, we recognise and identified a need to understand the structural foundations, which may help partly explain why the SDGs are not successfully being met. And there's really a need to move beyond performative change towards, systems that promote transformative outcomes. Next slide. So we kind of closed our commentary with introducing a potential research agenda, service research agenda for SDG 11 and 16 and beyond. And we identified three priority kind of areas for that. First, to encourage service researchers and service research to engage with critical social theories. We've heard that, a lot of the service research addressing the SDGs tends to cluster around, dominant theoretical perspectives and not a kind of broad brush approach. We identified that critical social theories can help us unpick, what perspectives other than Western neoliberal capitalism can inform service theory and practice. It can help with power analysis. How is power held and distributed and used in service ecosystems, and how can services help address such power imbalances? And also, how does political ideology shape service ecosystems and the design and delivery of services addressing these SDGs? The second pillar was to embrace plural and polyvocal approaches. We've heard earlier about how it's really going to be important moving forward for service research to better respect and be informed by Global South cosmological, ontological, epistemological and research perspectives in ways that can cultivate sustainable and pluriversal communities and change. And how might these different ontologies and epistemologies be brought in dialogue with each other without using dominant ontologies to interpret all others? So what that effectively means is, in kind of calling for, Global South perspectives to be, more recognised in service research, it's not about pushing to the side, existing knowledge systems. It's about bringing them into dialogue with each other to develop a kind of more plural consensus for moving forward. And then our third and final point was about the need to rethink the Service Research Academy itself. In what ways are academic institutions perpetuating the dominant, Western capitalist ideologies, and how can alternative ideologies potentially inform institutional work, as well as how can service educators incorporate critical and transdisciplinary perspectives into their teaching, even things like their reading lists, case studies, class activities, and assessment tasks, as well as their research and their writing. And we kind of closed off with identifying, the need for us to kind of build on some of the existing threads in service research that are quite nascent, to think about moving towards the development of a critical service research paradigm. And my closing point is just to encourage people that are interested in that idea and that agenda, that we're running a special session at ServCollab 2024 conference in Bordeaux on that topic towards a critical service research paradigm. And that will be a dialogic and participatory session where it's really about fostering ideas and stimulating dialogue to develop an agenda for moving that idea forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And over to Andrew for our sixth and penultimate commentary.
So we were tasked, Hugh, George, and myself were asked to comment on 3 of the SDGs. And actually, it was such a pleasure working. I know, George, I had the opportunity to work with you for the first time. It was really nice. And just at the start of this webinar, I got a Google Scholar alert that we have our first citation for this article, for this commentary. So far, so good. Next slide, please. Our 3 commentaries were climate change, life below water, and life on land. And as everyone did, we did a rapid review. There is some work on climate action or climate change. There was, at the risk of offending someone maybe who's on the webinar who may have done work, we didn't find anything at all for life below water or life on land. So our commentary is not at all focused on a review or trying to get our arms around any literature. It's really just trying to specify some research questions and to develop a conceptual framework so that it can spur some additional research. Next slide, please. So yeah, there were a modest number of articles. You know, we have articles on ecosystems, service ecosystems, some peripheral articles, nothing really that talked about these SDGs in the service literature. My particular topic was life underwater, and as I recall, the rapid review turned up a lot of things like transportation and ships and shipping in very obscure and non-service journals. So again, we didn't get a whole lot from that. If you could advance that, please. So one thing that we talked about was that this term service ecosystem has been utilized or starting to be utilized pretty widely in service research. But the fundamental concepts and processes and characteristics of ecosystems, that term is developed in ecology and biology and natural sciences, have not yet been applied to our fundamental understanding of service ecosystems. So we really tried to bring in some of that terminology and some of that intelligence from a field outside of our own. If you could advance that, I'd appreciate it. So here's our conceptual model. Really, at the heart of this is urging various actors, as you see around, to move from parasitism, where one being will benefit and the other one suffers, commensalism, where one being benefits but the other one has no effect, and mutualism, where both beings benefit from an interaction. And one of the things that we hopefully make very clear and are very strong in advocating is a broadening of the perspective, I think, that Ray introduced initially, which is looking to sustain or to benefit planetary conditions for the next generation of humans. That's, to us, a very egocentric, anthropocentric perspective, that we took an ecocentric perspective. And humans are in no way at the top of any hierarchy, if one exists. The more that human beings learn about nature, the more we realize that's true. And there's so much we can learn from nature. Let me give you a couple of really, really rapid examples. Trees are and the terminology has not caught up with this yet, so I'm going to use some terms that are really inappropriate for this, but trees are way, quote unquote, smarter than we think, and they have much more agency than we believe. They do things intentionally, and they show that they are able to perceive their environment and make decisions accordingly. Another discovery that was made by human beings just at the end of 2023 was that elephants actually have names for each other. And this is the first time that any species other than humans have been found to name themselves and name one another and to actually utilize those names in their communications. So, you know, if at any point in human history we thought we knew it all, I'm here to tell you we don't. And we're learning more and more, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. So we're by no means at the top of any hierarchy, and there's so much we can learn from nature and from other beings. And so we really need to think about them as partners in value co-creation and partners and different actors in the service ecosystem that's non-hierarchical. That's sort of a circular or flat arrangement. And we purposely blended the colors on the outside to show that these are very interdependent and interrelated. So next slide, please. So we did specify some future research directions, make this real quick. I think there's, given that we didn't find a lot of literature in any of the 3 SDGs, I think there's pretty sort of blue ocean or a lot of open space. Excuse me. But certainly learning more about service ecosystems from natural ecosystems and this through the concept of biomimicry, really urging to move relationships not only between humans, but humans and other species, other actors, from parasitism toward commensalism and eventually toward mutualism is critically important. And expand the range of actors, really understand sort of, you know, how different interactions, how different resource integration happens among the various levels that were evident in the conceptual model. So those are the kinds of highlights. I don't want to touch on everything, but I would urge you to access the free download in the month of May and to read the commentary. Hugh, George, and I will be presenting this at some summer conferences. So if you're attending some of the summer service conferences, we'd love to see you, and we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to discuss and collaborate with you further. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. And our last commentary, bringing it all together, will be presented by Satan. Over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I will try to be quick and loud because outside protesters are getting larger and louder. So I had the pleasure of working on this commentary with 3 other ServCollab operational officers, Ray, Radula, and Karim. Can we go to the next one, Rebecca? So this is our visual representation of the final team collaboration, because we believe, first of all, collaboration is in the title of ServCollab, that is serving humanity through collaboration, but also collaboration among people is the foundation of human service systems. So our main thesis is that to be able to address all those other 6 themes, we need collaboration. We need collaboration among scholars, researchers, but also with other stakeholders as well. Next slide, please. So human interactions are central to human experiences. So adopting from this paper, Fisk et al. To 2020 JOSM paper, there are 4 different categories of human interaction. On one hand, we have conflict and competition. And conflict and competition are characterized by oppositional logic of winners and losers. Usually we have winners and then we have some losers because that's just the way they are designed. On the other hand, cooperation and collaboration, they are characterized by mutualistic logic of benefits for everyone. And more importantly, in this again paper, we suggest that collaboration is the highest form of human interaction based on shared purpose. So that's one important thing about collaboration that kind of differentiates it from other types of human interaction. Next slide, please. I think, yes, the conflict is parasitism and collaboration is mutualism. They are characterized by that. Yes, next, Rebecca. So United Nations SDGs, when you look at them and when you look at the ServCollab goals, there are 4 main points that we explain in this commentary. First of all, service is the universal force in human society. I think this is something that we all agree on, the central role played by service to address those issues. The second important thing, again, based on the Fisk et al. 2020 paper, collaboration elevates the human experience. So if you really want to elevate human experience, we want to improve society, collaboration is the key. And another important thing is service design can play a key role for collaboration, because collaboration itself is in fact a design process. And I believe it's in Newman 2023, there's a book, and based on that book, everyone can be a collaborative designer. So that when we talk about collaboration, in fact, it's a design process, and we can all be part of that design process and be part of the collaboration as well. Next, Rebecca. Yeah, again, I will not just spend too much time on that, but we have 3 major collaboration research areas. Again, interesting thing is that just like Andrew mentioned for their team, collaboration in this way has not been addressed in service literature much. So we identify 3 overall research areas for collaboration. One is collaborative communication, how to communicate UN SDGs to service scholars, and also how to create that collaboration through different communication mechanisms. The second one is collaboration with technologies. Again, this is the kind of obvious one. How to use technology and technological platforms, technology-based tools to enable collaboration among scholars, but also with other stakeholders. And the last one that we are also very much interested in ServCollab, collaborative research projects. Again, what type of research projects can be helpful service researchers to address and to study UN SDG related topics. So this was my very short presentation of this final commentary, so that I hope we will have some time for questions at the end. Thank you again, Rebecca, Ray, Mark, organizing this and giving us the opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Satan. So we now have time for questions.